Usually, when I produce these podcasts, they are full of facts and press clippings and references. But today, we are going to do things a little differently. Because as the media, the press, and our foolish and inept Prime Minister, Theresa May, have not presented any evidence whatsoever to prove that President Assad's forces have used chemical gas in Syria, we are going to look at this issue from a point of common sense, and we are going to assess whether it was likely that President Assad's forces would have carried out this alleged gas attack. Or maybe, just maybe, this attack was either faked or carried out by other groups or nations desperate to bring Western powers into the war in Syria. Now, earlier, I urged for the use of common sense when dealing with this issue. However, when analysing this alleged gassing, we will be applying an ancient European legal saying. That saying is cui bono, which is a rhetorical Latin legal phrase used to imply that whoever appears to have the most to gain from a crime is probably the culprit. A literal translation of cui bono is, to whom is it a benefit? Now, before we look into who stands to benefit the most from this incident, it is important to note that the British state and the establishment media have not presented any evidence to prove that President Assad's forces had anything to do with this latest supposed chemical attack. So as there is no evidence and there is only conjecture, let's start by assessing the situation in Syria before we go any further. Essentially, Assad has won the war, a war that began all the way back in 2011. A war that was meant to topple him and his regime, and a war that was enthusiastically supported by the Western media and Western leaders who cheered from the sidelines for those who attacked the Syrian regime. And those opposed to the Syrian regime became collectively known as the Syrian rebels. But who are the Syrian rebels? Well, ISIS and Al-Qaeda were the two largest organised groups opposing President Assad in Syria. And please note, Al-Qaeda are operating under the name Al-Nusra Front in the region. So here we have Western leaders who previously had been dedicated to fighting a war on terror, supporting the same terrorist groups in their aim to overthrow a democratically elected leader in a secular republic. And yes, Syria is secular. In fact, President Assad has been repeatedly praised by Christians and other religious minorities in the region for protecting them against the rebel forces. Because one thing is for certain, had the rebels won the war in Syria, had ISIS and Al-Qaeda prevailed, there would have been no Christians or any other non-Muslim groups left in Syria, as they would have been driven out or massacred. Or worse still, the females would have shared the same fate as many Yazidi women who were captured and used as sex slaves by ISIS. But despite the rebels in Syria being made up of various terrorist groups, they were enthusiastically supported by Western leaders. And when I say supported, I don't just mean with words and prayers. Western leaders supported these terrorists by supplying them with armaments and providing them with training in order to ensure they could do the maximum amount of damage possible to the Syrian army. This enabled the rebels to be more effective and disable or destroy Syrian army tanks, armour, and even target aircraft. But against all the odds, Assad's forces emerged victorious. The tide finally turned at the beginning of 2016, when the Syrian army brought the war to the Islamist rebels and took back Aleppo, the city the rebels had declared as their capital. I read this from the BBC's website. It was posted on the 13th of January 2016, and I quote, "Backed by Iranian senior officers and skilled Hezbollah fighters, Mr. Assad's forces have gained the upper hand and achieved significant gains in the north, south, Damascus suburbs, and now the Aleppo area. Aleppo, capital of the revolution as the rebels call it, is a strategic prize for the Damascus government." End quote. Since Aleppo was taken back by the Syrian government, the Syrian army has continued to make huge gains, and with the backing of President Putin and Russian air support, the Syrian rebels have been all but beaten. So in the dying days of this bloody civil war, with the rebels scattered and almost beaten, their supply lines cut off, Russian air superiority ensuring that they cannot move freely, and most strategic positions in Syria being back in government hands, Assad's position is the strongest it has been since the beginning of the conflict. He has the upper hand. He is on the cusp of total victory, and the Western powers who longed for this war and backed the terrorist rebels have very little, if any, public support for military involvement in Syria. Then out of nowhere, on April the 7th of this year, a chemical attack was reported to have been carried out in the Syrian city of Douma, and at least 70 people were reportedly killed by chlorine and sarin gas. Now let's just back up one moment. Several Western leaders, including the former President of the United States, Barack Obama, and the French President, Emmanuel Macron, have said that the use of chemical weapons in Syria would be a red line, that if crossed would lead to their military involvement in Syria. But just days before this alleged gas attack, President Trump had just announced to the American public that he would be pulling US troops out of Syria very soon. In fact, on April the 4th, just 3 days before this alleged attack, the New York Times stated the following, and I quote, "President Trump has instructed his military commanders to quickly wrap up the American military operation in Syria so that he can bring troops home within a few months," senior administration officials said on Wednesday. He dropped his insistence on an immediate withdrawal, they said, after commanders told him they needed time to complete their mission. End quote. So President Trump had called for an immediate withdrawal of US troops, but in the end settled on a withdrawal within months. But either way, it looked like 2018 would see an end of US military involvement in Syria, and American boots on the ground were about to be a thing of the past in the country. But just days after this announcement, with American troops packing up to return home, President Assad is supposed to have crossed the red line and used chemical gas. Assad has won the war. The rebels are on the run. Western politicians have neither a viable reason nor the public support necessary to get involved in what is left of the conflict in Syria. Yet we are meant to believe that Assad used chemical weapons, the one action that could jeopardize his entire campaign, the one action that could undo every gain that he has made, the one action that could actually snatch victory from his grasp. But who is making these claims about President Assad and his alleged use of chemical gas? Claims that haven't been backed up by a shred of evidence. The answer to that question is the very same people who have been itching for Western involvement in Syria since the conflict began all the way back in 2011. The media, the puppet politicians, and their internationalist backers are all making this rather unbelievable and unfounded claim, a claim that both the Russian and Syrian governments have aggressively denied. Now, I'm not naive, and I can actually see why a regime may use chemical weapons as an act of desperation. Let's say this war had gone the other way. Let's hypothesize that the rebels, the cutthroats and terrorists who have been tearing Syria apart and murdering Christians, government supporters and other religious minorities had surrounded Damascus and everything looked hopeless. The city was besieged and there was no way out for the survivors. The last defenders were tired, wounded, starving and running dangerously low on munitions. Those civilians left in Damascus, along with the military personnel and government ministers, all faced certain death if ISIS and al-Nusra were to take the city. The situation is desperate, and in a last-ditch attempt to punch through the enemy lines, Assad orders the use of a chemical strike. It's a final gamble, like the last wild swipes of a cornered and injured animal. At that point, it wouldn't matter what red line the Western nations had drawn in the Syrian sand. It would have been do or die. But in reality, the very opposite is true. The only way President Assad could now lose this war is if either America or European nations entered the conflict and used their military might to smash the Syrian government forces. Essentially, for Assad to be defeated at this late stage, Western nations would need to do more than just arm the Islamist rebels. They would need to do the fighting for the rebels. So it is very clear to anyone with an ounce of common sense that President Assad, the Russians, and the Syrian regime had nothing whatsoever to gain by using chemical weapons. Not one thing. In fact, using chemical weapons is the one thing that could jeopardize everything they have fought for and actually be the one action that could cause them to lose the war. So who does stand to benefit by making it appear as if President Assad's forces used chemical weapons in Syria? Well, the Syrian rebels, aka ISIS and Al-Qaeda, the Western governments and their internationalist puppet masters, the banks who fund these wars, the arms manufacturers who profit from these wars, as well as Syria's enemies in the region, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and of course, Israel. So let's have a quick rundown on the groups and governments that have the most to gain from this supposed chemical attack. Firstly, we have two of the most brutal terrorist groups known to man. Groups responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths across the Middle East, bombings and acts of terrorism across the Western world, and gruesome acts of torture and execution in the territories they occupy. I think it's highly likely that these groups would stage a chemical attack or carry out a chemical attack in order to frame the Syrian regime with the intention of bringing Western powers into the war. These terrorist groups have very little, if any, scruples, and the victims of any staged attack would merely be regarded as collateral damage to them. Secondly, we have the Western powers and the Western media, who have been desperate for Western involvement in Syria since the outbreak of the war. And we know that we cannot take seriously anything either the media or the Western governments say when it comes to issues in the Middle East. Let's not forget when Britain and the US went to war in Iraq over weapons of mass destruction that were never found because there never were any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in the first place. Tony Blair and George W. Bush took Britain and America into a war based on lies. Now, I did a full video on this called Wars for Israel Drive Mass Immigration. It's linked in the description below, so please take the time to watch that if you want to know the extent of the lies told before the invasion of Iraq about fictional weapons of mass destruction. Thirdly, we have the moneylenders and the arms manufacturers. Banks always profit in times of war, and the American industrial military complex is constantly hoping for new foreign conflicts in order to ensure their continued funding. Finally, we have Syria's enemies in the region. We have Saudi Arabia, a nation that has funded terrorism all over the world. We have Turkey, a nation that is desperate to secure a pipeline through Syria in order to provide natural gas to the EU as an alternative to Russian gas. And we have Israel, a nation that has meddled relentlessly in the Syrian conflict, a nation that has armed and aided the terrorist groups fighting against the Syrian army, and a nation that has taken it upon itself to bomb Syrian bases. So when applying common sense in the current situation, when looking at this alleged incident and asking to whom is it a benefit, and remember, this is all we can do, as neither the Western governments, the Syrian rebels, or Syria's enemies in the region have provided any evidence to prove this attack was either genuine or indeed perpetrated by Assad's forces. It is clear that the only groups that could benefit from this alleged attack are the Western governments, the Syrian rebels, Syria's enemies in the region, and all those that profit from prolonging this conflict and involving the US in another costly war in the Middle East. So it is clear to see who would have had motive to carry out or stage this attack. And it is also very obvious that the Syrian regime and President Assad could gain nothing from carrying out an attack like this. What's more, never forget the same Western governments that are asking us to trust them on this issue have a long track record of lying about issues in the Middle East to further their own agenda. And that agenda always seems to be military action at the behest of their greatest ally, the State of Israel. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help spread the message by liking and sharing it on social networks. If you want to hear more from me, please hit the subscribe button, as new videos are posted every week. You can also read my book, The Fall of Western Man. It's available as a free ebook and in both hardback and paperback, and all the links are in the description below. Finally, if you want to join in the discussion with me, feel free to add me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. Also, you can now follow me on Gab, Minds and BitChute as well. Everyone's welcome.